Hello, my name is Ethan Cunningham. I'm with Cohort 9 of the Lockheed Martin Leadership Institute at Miami University. Here with me today is the Robert D. Johnson Director of the Isaac and Oxley Center for Business Leadership and the Director of Leadership Development at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University, Dr. Megan Gerhardt. She's been teaching and conducting research in the field of management and organizational leadership for 16 years, winning multiple university awards for her classroom teaching. Our current area of research, which we plan to dive into today, focuses on leveraging generational diversity in the workplace. Dr. Gerhardt, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks for having me.
So in 2017, you developed the Gentelligence movement and you're releasing a book by the same title on June 8th. Could you give us just like a little bit of background on Gentelligence and the research that led up to it?
Sure. So Gentelligence is, as you said, it's a term that I created to represent the idea that we need to narrate this conversation about generational differences more intelligently than we have in the past. And so we have a lot of research on best practices on how to effectively manage diversity, cross-cultural differences, all of those things in the workplace. And for some interesting reason, that research has not really been utilized or applied when it comes to generational differences or really age diversity very effectively. So I look at both of those things kind of together. It's hard to disentangle the two of them. So a lot of my work is on, how do we look at generational differences in the workplace, which is a reality. It's always going to be a reality. It always has been a reality. We have 5 different generations now working together. How do we look at that as an opportunity rather than as a threat? Historically, it's been framed very negatively as a source of frustration and tension and conflict, which is really unproductive. And when you sit and think about whether we would tolerate that kind of a framing on any other kind of diversity, I think the answer would be no. So in some ways, it's one of these last lingering sort of acceptable biases where people feel comfortable using someone's generational category as an insult. We saw this with the OK Boomer phenomenon, right, last year. But even on the flip side, the word millennial is often used in sort of an insulting, condescending way. And so Gentelligence is really trying to reframe those conversations and talk about, how do we actually leverage that diversity of thought in a way that can make us more effective and stronger rather than, erode or be a source of conflict.
That's super cool. That's such an odd concept to think of age as a diversity or differences and kind of stuff like that. And so I really enjoy, that kind of research, that kind of like, oh, I never thought about that before.
Excellent.
And so kind of get into like one of those subcategories. When we talk about Envision 2040, we're thinking about like who's going to be, in the workplace. And I personally will be 40 years old, which is kind of crazy to think. And so what kind of, as part of like Generation Z, like what kind of characteristics do you think Generation Z holds compared to like other generations?
Yeah, so what I like to say is that generations should be best used as one form or one layer of identity. So where we get into trouble is when we start stereotyping, just like any other kind of difference, right? All Gen Zs are this way, all millennials are that way. But I also say that, generational differences are important. I always say they're not everything, but they're not nothing. So there's an interesting debate in the academic literature about how much should we care about someone's generational identity. So just as a quick background, if you use it as a lens to help you understand why certain people may look at things differently than you or may behave in a way that doesn't make any sense to you, then it's productive, right? Then it's a lens for understanding. And so every generational identity has what I call kind of a snapshot or a narrative, right? How did they, develop their view of work and in the world and their attitudes and things like that. And it really stems back to what we call formative experiences. So if we take your generation, Gen Z, the dates we use for that are people that were born 1997 to, we're going to say question mark right now, Ethan, because prior to the pandemic, the sort of school of thought was we were going to cut Gen Z at 2012 because most generations are approximately 15 to 20 years in length. However, because of obviously the events of the last year, I think probably the cutoff will be closer to something like 2015, just because we'll want everyone included in Generation Z to have sort of an active memory of what happened in the last year, which would make that, maybe 2015. So you were 5 years old at the youngest if you're part of Gen Z when the pandemic occurred. That's my prediction. So we'll use, just for the sake of our conversation, 1997 to about 2015-ish. So that said, thinking about the things that have been really substantial formative events in your life, in the life of your peers, people who grow up in this common time in history, we can point to certain things. Obviously, everybody has a different experience, but things like school violence, right? So growing up with the reality that there could be an active shooter, and security measures or active shooter drills in school was not something. I am 44, and that was not something. We had tornado drills. We didn't have active shooter drills, right? Social media, right? So while the millennials got all this attention for being digital natives and the internet, and your generation, the prevalence of social media as a way to not just communicate, but also get news, leading to concerns about things like fake news, right? So like when I grew up, there was the news. I always say this, and you guys, like, which news, right? Which news will you choose to consume? Of course, what's happened in the last year with the pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement. We could go on and on about the different things that the recession, right? Things that affected the way you grew up, the economic reality, what opportunities are going to be available for all of you. And then also the way, probably most important for your conference and your research, things like that influence the way you view work, the way you view your life, the balance between them, what paths seem like they make the most sense. And so part of the reason that we give a generation like a 15 to 20 year window is we want to know what happened during the first, 5 to 15 years of your life. So if we think about you age 5 to age 20, let's say, those are the most important years of your life from a formation standpoint, right? Because what was going on with your family, what was going on politically, socially, what was the parenting approach that was popular when your generation was growing up, all of that influences who you become. And then, of course, we all, for example, have experienced the pandemic, but for your generation, it influenced your education. It influenced whether people are going to be able to afford to go to college, right? What internships and jobs Ethan's going to have available to him in the next couple years when he wants to start his career. And so that's why we pay so much attention to it, because there's research showing us that those formative years really matter. So if we go to your question about what will Gen Z be like, right? The verdict is still kind of out. The youngest Gen Zs are little kids. But if we look at your age, right? If we look at the people who have been in the workforce for a couple years now, and then those of you just coming out, I can give you early predictions, and then maybe we can talk about how that feeds into what you will do to shape the world of work. I think before the pandemic, we saw your generation being much more thoughtful about the path you wanted to take in terms of education and career. So whereas my generation and the millennials really felt like, you graduate high school, the majority of people who could afford it, right, we're just going to go on to college, no questions asked. You had to, otherwise you're never going to get the kind of job you want. Gen Z, I think, is pushing back on that and saying, well, hold on, what am I getting for that? Do I want all this debt? Do I want, what's my return on that investment? What kind of jobs are going to be available? Do I want those jobs? So we're starting to see more Gen Zs think about alternative paths. And now with the pandemic and a lot of kids taking like a gap year or waiting to go to college, that's just sort of blown up. So we're going to see, my prediction is we will see some Gen Zs take the traditional college path. What they major in will probably be more conservative in terms of, if I'm going to do that, I want to make sure there's a job on the other end. Their parents are going to want to make sure there's a job, and they're going to want to make sure there's a job. So that's where sort of this, I want 3 years of an internship trend has come from. Like, let me make sure this route is going to pay off. So we will see, I think, people continue to take that route, but maybe with a little less of the risk propensity that the millennials had. Like, if I can't find just the right thing with my degree in X, I'll wait till the right job comes along. And, you know, I don't think that's going to continue. I think we're going to see Gen Z really want a definite path. And then I think the other path for Gen Z is going to be more non-traditional. So I think we're going to see a couple things, and we wrote about this in the book. We're going to see what's called new collar jobs. So, you know, blue collar, white collar. You've heard of that. The term new collar has now been coined for jobs that require advanced training, but not a 4-year degree. So it might be on one end something like the skilled trades, right? So we are having a huge dip in people who are qualified to do these very skilled trades like electrician, plumber, welder, carpenter. Because if you think about it, what's the age of almost any person that comes to your house to fix the sink or fix the wiring, right? Or lay bricks, or they tend to be older because people, I'm a Gen Xer, people in my generation weren't encouraged to go into that as a career path. Millennials were not flocking to those kinds of skilled trades. So what's happened is all the experts in those fields are, you know, 60 plus, and they're retiring. So the baby boomer generation that had a lot of people willing to go into that route are retiring, and there's no one to replace them. So now we've seen all these incentives where they're starting to do apprenticeships, which you haven't heard of an apprenticeship in a long time. An apprenticeship, my nephew, who's a junior in high school, his high school is offering welding apprenticeships, and he goes and works with a welder, and there's a guaranteed job for him when he graduates high school, like a very well-paying job. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things we're going to see. And then the new collar jobs also refer to jobs that require high degrees of tech training, but not traditional college. So Google just this week came out with, I don't know if you saw that, but the no college required tech certificates to train in like coding and things you understand better than I do. Yeah, you don't have to go to college, but you have to do their training program to then qualify. And these are jobs where there's a high demand and a low supply of people. So I think we're going to see a lot more Gen Zs being willing to take those paths of their interest, which I think is a good thing, rather than assuming a 4-year degree is going to be it. So I'll stop there. That was a lot, but you can, whatever follow-up questions you have, or I'm happy to talk more, but that's sort of our sense in terms of an education and career path that we're going to see that change.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome insight. You wouldn't even think about, you know, kids my age, like, man, I really want to be a welder, or like, I really want to be a plumber, but like those jobs are obviously things we have to fill. So that's awesome.
And they pay pretty well too. It's just, you know, it's a question of how desirable do they seem to a particular generation. And a lot of that is driven by demand, right? And the other sort of thing to work in is, for example, we interviewed a lot of people when we were writing our book. And I talked to some people that work at a shipbuilding company out on the East Coast. So very old, multi-generational shipbuilding company where a lot of people have, you know, their families have worked there for multiple generations. But again, not a job that a lot of young people are sort of flocking to traditionally. And so what they're trying to do is create these opportunities for younger people to come in, be mentored by our baby boomers who have held those jobs and have all that organizational knowledge, but bring their tech skills in. So this is where, you know, you may have heard of the phrase reverse mentoring, where younger people mentor older people, usually in tech. We, in the book, actually suggest we stop calling it that and we call it mutual mentoring, because reverse sort of suggests that it's backwards for you to teach me something, when in fact it's very common these days to need that. And so, but in the shipbuilding example, you know, let's say you know how to do 3D printing, 3D modeling, 3D design. That's incredibly in demand in that kind of industry, but not something, it's not that baby boomers or my generation can't do it, but it's not a natural thing that we've sort of picked up the way your generation has. So it does require some training and some sort of upskilling and things like that. So they were talking about trying to set up programs to attract the younger generation to learn the trade and the industry, but also be able to teach, which is obviously appealing on a lot of levels.
Yeah, that's definitely a relationship that, like, between older and younger generations that I can't say that I've heard of, but it's definitely a really cool, and I kind of like the way that you're like trying to change that narrative of, like, to mutual relation or mutual mentorship. Very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff. What, so like, just going off of that, since we're talking about it, are there like other hurdles or like challenges that you like could foresee in the future between Gen Z and older generations, and maybe some like how to combat?
Yeah, so we identify in the book 4 roadblocks that get in the way of any sort of Gentelligence effort. So this would include Gen Z. The first one is generational shaming. So this idea that it's fun or it's clever to be, shaming someone based on a form of their identity they have no control over. So I've been pretty outspoken about this, specifically when it came to the millennials. So that's what my TED Talk on that sort of kicked a lot of this off is about. Obviously, as a professor, I work with young people every single day, and I learn a ton from my students who are now Gen Z, but at the time, for a long time were millennials. And so, using millennial, as a form of insult is not okay. And we have to stop doing that. They can't control that they're millennials, and there's a lot of really impressive things that the millennial generation does. They see things in ways that have been influenced by, this is a great example of how parenting philosophies impacted generations. So the millennials were the first generation raised as sort of the center of their family, right? They were very invested in lots of classes and lessons and expectations and pressure to be a lot of things at a very young age. College expectations and admission standards went up because of how sort of enriched and prepared the millennials were. And so they really were the focus of attention and resources and time. And that's where there's this idea of helicopter parenting came in, that their parents were very invested in protecting them and wanting them to be successful. Well, when they then came to the workplace, they expected to be kind of central and have a voice and have an impact the way they had their whole life. And and managers didn't like that. They thought it was entitled and pushy and inappropriate, and it was just different. It's just like when you don't understand, the example I give is if you go to Europe, you're going to see behavior that you don't understand. And your first reaction is, what's wrong with those people? Why would they act that way? Why aren't they acting the way I act? And then when you sit and think about it, you say, well, that's an ignorant way to look at it. They're acting that way because of the way they grew up, their cultural norms, the way things work in their world. It's the exact same argument when it comes to generations. So, my emphasis has always been understand, you need to understand what's behind the behavior, not just sort of react through your own lens. So we talk about the roadblocks of generational shaming, not, using someone's generation as a form of insult. The second one is age bias, and this is age bias and reverse age bias. So both, assuming older people can't use technology, right? Which there's no research showing that's true. A lot of older people have been using technology before you were born. Yeah. They may have invented the technology that we're all using, but older people use it differently than younger people. So it's not as natural. It requires training, and it's not as pervasive for older people. They don't use it for everything the way that younger people do. So again, instead of having this bias, but it works the other way too. Like younger people are assumed to be entitled or assumed to be unreliable or, whatever it might be. There's not really any research backing up a lot of those biases. And so that's the second roadblock. The other two I'll kind of talk about together just in the interest of time. And those are sort of presumptions we have about values being different, that you and I must value something very different. So how can we be expected to work together? When in fact, we all have universal values. You know, we all want to be respected in the workplace. We all want to be seen as competent. We all want to be connected to each other. We all want to have autonomy or some degree of like independence and ownership over our work. And there are some differences across generations and values that are interesting in terms of frequency, but there's those 4 universal ones that underlie almost everything. And what it comes down to is, as I said before, you know, if you come to my office and you say, I have this great idea of how we can totally do this whole conference and I think it's going to be amazing, I can choose to say, well, who does he think he is? He's only 20 years old. Like, I've been working here for 20 years. I was working here before you were born, son. Like, you go back out there and do what I tell you to do. How entitled, right? I could choose to have that as my reaction. Or I could stop and say, okay, what's going on? Like, he wants to gain respect. He wants to be seen as competent. He's trying to connect with me and have us work on something together. I get that. I want that too. I wouldn't do it that way, but I'm also not 20. So let me think about what he's interested in, what's driving his behavior, and then start there. Right? So not assuming we're so different, and instead saying, like, I get why he would come in and be this excited, and how can I coach him, or how can I discuss with him, you know, what he's talking about, and then give him some feedback as well. Right? And then the last part of that is, you know, this idea of knowledge differences, which is tied in. So historically, the older you were, the more knowledge you had, and therefore your job was to listen to me. Well, with the digital age, that got flipped on its head, right? Yes, I still have hopefully things to teach you, but for the first time ever, our younger generations were learning a new kind of knowledge faster and more easily than older people. And so it put us in this position where there were different kinds of valuable knowledge that didn't necessarily equate with age. And so a roadblock is to recognize that you could have unique insights and knowledge that I don't have. And that's not a threat to me. That doesn't mean I don't have any, right? It's not a competition. And so that's the last roadblock we talk about, is being willing to kind of disengage from this us versus them competition and sort of say, love to hear your ideas, Ethan. Like, how would you approach this conference? And you tell me, and I say, oh, that's awesome. I love that. Let me ask some questions though. Like, we might run into this problem, like using my experience in your innovation to create some, that's Gentelligence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's awesome. Awesome. That little flip mindset is kind of the thing.
It's the thing, right?
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Gerhardt, it was it was just a pleasure talking to you. Just a lot of like great insights, and super, super excited for this book coming out in June. I'm sure you're excited to release it too.
I am. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So, thank you. Like I said, thank you so much for being here today.